Well, thanks very much for the very gracious introduction, and I also want to thank Governor Snyder for clarifying that it's not me that's dumb and dangerous, actually, but some of the EPA regulations. That was very nice of him as well. So I want to go back to a little bit more than a year ago, and that's when I first got involved in this. So it was on a Friday that I got a call from the administrator of EPA, and she told me that my boss, the administrator for EPA Region 5, had resigned, and it's now up to me. You're in charge, and she had very specific instructions for me. She said, go protect human health and the environment. That was what she told me to do as I sort of assumed charge of it. My very first thing that I did was send one person, and many people thought we'd send somebody that had experience in a water plant or somebody that had experience in many different fields like maybe regulation of these plants, and instead what I chose to do was send the one guy that responds when you have a train derailment, when you have something like a tank car blow up, when you have a chemical plant blow up. We call them OSCs, or on-scene coordinators. So we shifted the paradigm completely. I sent my army of one that one day on a Saturday and said, many people in the room know him, Mark Durno, do this one thing. Figure out what's going on with, of all things, chlorine. And I'm getting to the infrastructure part. Chlorine. And he went out with one handheld meter, one Hawk meter, tested some sites, called me live, took pictures of what he was doing, and said, Bob, we're not finding chlorine in the system. So this is January of 2016. This is not all that long ago that this happened. And to be thinking now that we would be convening a Flint water infrastructure summit with all these people, making sure that we had international, national focus, and putting Flint in the lead for all this is almost unthinkable. And I think I might have be also quoting Rich when I said to that person, are you out of your freaking mind? If some person had told me that, and I hope I would have said freaking just as Rich would have done. So there's been an evolution in my thinking as I go through this. The very first thing in the summer of 2015, as we started to parse some of the issues here, the issues really were all about the lead and copper rule. And they were about how do we regulate and what do the regulations say. And that's where the terms of the debate were as we were going through and parsing and saying what does the rule say. But very quickly, we progressed on from there. We moved on from that particular focus and moved on to the operational aspects of it. And we started to ask questions like, how do we fix the system in terms of recoating the pipes? We started to ask questions, as I posed to Mark Durno, what's the status of chlorine residual in the system? And we started to focus really intently on how to operate the system and make sure that it was doing the best that it possibly could. And it's in the course of that operational inquiry, and again, that was only a year ago, that I had two epiphanies. They started to think about this whole thing differently. People ask me, do I have a Flint stump speech? And I do, and it changes every single time because the situation in Flint changes every single time. And the one epiphany, the one thing that really came to me is what we were really doing at the time was stabilizing. I think we called it fixing Flint, and in fact, I remember some media outlets putting a microphone on my face and saying, what are you doing here in terms of your sampling and your recommendations? And I think I said fixing at the time. That's an evolution in my thinking, because what we were really doing was essentially the aspirin. What we were really doing was the stabilization phase. And that's a very good thing and had to be done because we are in emergency response mode. And as you'll hear today, we have made tremendous progress, vast progress in terms of the amount of lead that has been removed from the system. Keith is going to tell you about the most recent testing as recent as this week. And a spoiler alert, it's all good news. So that's all that's happened. It's all really good things. But again, that's the nature of stabilization. It's not fixing. The next epiphany, the next big thing that kind of came to me during this, and this was melding a couple of things that I do at the office every day. Most of what we do in the office, our biggest directorship, is Superfund. We have over 300 people devoted to Superfund. So throughout the 6 states that I work in, we have hundreds and hundreds of Superfund sites, and that's what we do, is fix a legacy problem. We all know the story of Love Canal. And the story of Love Canal and other early Superfund sites unfolded very similarly to this, where you had very big harm and a lot of, I'd say, blame and finger pointing and people saying, you didn't do this right at the state, local, federal level. And what it really came down to is, you know what, this is a 100-year-old or 150-year-old problem, and it needs a comprehensive solution that's going to require a lot of money to deal with. That was back in 1980, and people said, you know what, you need this super fund to deal with it, to do the cleanup. Well, the lead pipes that are in the ground, that's the same sort of a problem. That's a legacy problem that we are all faced with and that we have to deal with. The infrastructure that has been decaying for so many years, that have been not maintained as well as it could have been over the years, that's a legacy problem. And the solution to it is all very similar. Thank you very much. That's better. All right, so as I said, as far as the initial fix, what came out of it is a relook at the lead and copper rule and some tweaks and some fixes. And I think initially folks looked at those fixes and said that was going to be good enough nationwide, that was sort of the lesson of Flint. And instead what's come out of it is we found that we have lots more concerns, that it's not going to be fixed with just merely tweaks to a regulation. In fact, we're not going to regulate our way out of this at all. That's for a number of different reasons. If you look at what was happening in Flint, we've got at least two large problems. The first is oversized and aging infrastructure. When I first heard oversized infrastructure, I thought that was a good thing. But then when you get into trying to keep a chlorine residual in a system that is too big, essentially population shrunk, then you've got some very large problems. And the decline in population that happened in Flint happened in many different cities as well. As we know, it's much harder to run a system that's bigger than what you need. You've got higher water age, you've got lower chlorine residual, and you've got just major problems with things like pathogens as a consequence of line breaks. So that's the first sort of thing. Second thing, we're all sitting down for this, is the lead pipes in the grounds. Many tens of thousands right here in Flint, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. So if you look at what's happening nationally, this really shined a light on what is in the ground. And we started to take a pretty hard look on what still remains to be done. You can count on the one hand the communities that have taken this problem on and addressed it, and none, I'll say, in the full and comprehensive visionary way that Flint has. So this is really not just the tip of the iceberg, but the way forward for the country. What's the scope of the problem? How many lead lines do we have throughout the country? We have about 10 million lead lines. So that's just an overwhelming problem. We have this iconic picture now. This is something that we took early on in this crisis. It's now sort of symbolic of many things. At all of our open houses, we showed these pipes and showed these pictures. But that's the scope of the problem, and I'm very much hoping to talk to the new administrator about those 10 million lead lines that we really need to get out. So now we look at the further scope of the problem across the country. Let's amplify it just a little bit more as we move along, and it's really huge. There are more than 300 million Americans who depend on 152,000 public drinking water systems. And if you look at the number of glasses per day, if you break it down to that, it's 1 billion glasses of tap water being consumed each day. So that's a tremendous amount of infrastructure to make sure is in place. If you look at the scope of the needs, so how much is it going to cost to fix all these things as far as wastewater goes, as far as stormwater infrastructure, and of course as far as drinking water? The number is absolutely huge. So we talk about, in terms of defense budgets, everyone knows what the size of the defense budget. This is about $660 billion over the course of the next 20 years. And that number came from communities themselves. This isn't EPA's estimate. Communities have totaled it up and told us. So again, as we're talking about the big numbers and the tremendous work that's been done in Flint, Flint is leading the way for a much larger national effort that has to be confronted within the next 20 years. So if you look at where this really matters, where the rubber meets the road, it really is in EJ communities, environmental justice communities. It's unthinkable that this might have happened think of the suburban collar community that is closest to your city. As soon as that water switch would have been made known, there would have been protests right away. And it would have happened in the first place because there would have been lots of funds available to deal with that infrastructure. Instead, you've got the sort of synergy of two terrible things. You've got poverty in some places, and you've got crumbling infrastructure, and one sort of feeds off the other. So that means that we have to recognize that the problem is most acute in terms of EJ communities, and we have to deal with it there. So this is, in many respects, a local problem, no question about it, but there are some federal and national responses. I want to touch on those as we go through these. The first one is the Drinking Water Action Plan. So in November of 2016, my former boss came up with the Drinking Water Action Plan. It has a number of different parts to it. The most important one is the very first one, and that's this one. It's fixing the crumbling infrastructure. The very last one is reducing lead risk through lead and copper rule. I'll suggest that that's the least important one for a reason I'm going to come to. This is worth looking at. If you're involved with water infrastructure throughout the country, I commend this document to you because it's really a blueprint for the future. And it goes through in 25 pages or so the most important needs for what we need to get done. So that was intended to be and is a white paper on what we are going to do in the future. And I know the new administration is taking a very careful look at it because that's one of their priorities as well. So now we get to the dumb and dangerous part to the conversation here, and that's the lead and copper rule. And if anyone wants to buy me a beer, I'll go on for a very long time about the problems of the lead and copper rule. There are lots and lots of things that need to be done with it. Absolutely, no question. The governor framed it a certain way. I'm not going to go that far, but I absolutely will say that it was a rule that had the best of intentions in 1991. And it doesn't fit the current situation in so many different respects. It needs to be overhauled. It is not as protective as it could be. And in many respects, people ask me what happened in Flint. There are definitely some bad decisions made, no question about it. But if you get to some of the root cause analyses, one of the things I'd point to is the lead and copper rule. Absolutely. One of the things I'd point to is the lead and copper rule. It needs to be overhauled. People say, was it the pilots that crashed the plane? And I really don't think so. A lot of times you have to look at the design of the plane and certainly the maintenance of it, and that's when you start asking the tough questions about the lead and copper rule. So what is the fix? Again, I sort of alluded to this earlier that I don't think the lead and copper rule, even if we completely reform that, is going to be the regulatory fix to all this. It's really going to be shovels in the ground. And if that's the case, then the key is the SRF. I know this is fairly small here, but this is the model many of you folks are familiar with. This is the state revolving fund. If you look at EPA's budget is about half SRF. It's a very, very large portion of what we do is give funds directly to the states. It functions just as a bank does. Money goes in, federal seed money, it gets matched by the state, so you see EPA and the state government over there to the left. You see bondholders, and the most important aspect of it is the far right, where you see the yellow metal moving. That's where things start to happen, and that's all a consequence of SRF funds moving to the states. So over the course of its lifetime, since about 1996 or so, it's been an enormously successful program. So let's figure out how much it's pumped into these sorts of fixes. If you look at just state drinking water all around the country, you can say, it's not too strong to say, it's all a result of the SRF. $32.5 billion have gone to water systems. That's a huge number. And that fixes water systems, it protects public health, sort of real world environmental protection, and it also does things like create jobs. So let me pause to note that the administrator of EPA, one point definitely of commonality that we all have with this new administration is a focus on infrastructure. And we're hoping to prevail upon this administration to focus really intently on bolstering things like the SRF and coming up with new and better ways to do it so that it answers some of our problems. In 2016 alone, SRF was responsible for $2.47 billion nationwide. Now we look at what happened in Flint, and we had our own mini SRF just for Flint. And that's going to be something that's announced in the next several weeks. You've already heard some of it, but we had something that was appropriately called the WIN Act, and that's the Water Infrastructure Improvements for the Nation Act. That's going to be a model, folks. That's something that the last Congress did in December of 2016. Tremendous resources to do the things that we need has to happen in Flint, and that's to fix things. $100 million in disaster-related grants through the Drinking Water SRF, and new EPA-operated grant programs for drinking water infrastructure needs, such as lead testing in schools. So you look at the model, what has to happen, and it's really that SRF, and then writ small, the WIN Act. So it's Flint that pioneered this entire model, and it's Flint that's going to take us forward in terms of fixing our infrastructure. When I brief the administrator, I'm going to point to the WIN Act and say, this is the national model, this is what has to happen. And if we're serious about fixing the problems, we're not going to spend the next 10 years tweaking and regulating and figuring out the lead and copper rule. And we're certainly not going to go back to that blueprint. What we're really going to do is shovels in the ground, and that means this SRF. So let me end and turn it over to Keith Creagh on this one note. The one thing I want to say is that none of this would have worked. We wouldn't have made any of the progress that we have made if we didn't do things like partner with each other. And I'll say that this has been an extremely effective partnership. It didn't start out that way necessarily, and there have been bumps in the road, no question. But at the end of the day, you've got a team here that has, in the course of a little bit over a year, managed to take one of the most difficult problems, unprecedented really across the nation, and come out with something that is outstanding at a future direction, not just for Flint, but the country. So with that, let me turn it over to my good friend, Keith Creagh.
So Rich said I was a brother by another mother. Actually, I am my own uncle. Let's figure that one out. So it's a pleasure to be here today with you. And I could just stand up here and say amen and sit down, but I'm a recovering bureaucrat, so I got to say a couple things. And so how do I get my slides up, Jim? Jim. Got them. Okay. Thank you. Just took a second. So, like Bob, where do you point this at? There you go. So like Bob, I got a call on December 28th, 2015 from the governor and governor's office, my good friend Rich Baird, saying, hey, how'd you like go do DEQ for a while? And I said, oh, it'd be a great opportunity. And I said, I can hardly wait. And I was kind of happy being DNR director. That's how the conversation went, Rich. I remember it well. And so my background, grew up in agriculture, regulatory guy, understand state primacy stuff. And so I kind of did that. I was an incident commander and understand crisis. And my career says I'm kind of an implementer. So we show up and there's emergencies declared and there's all sorts of activities going on. But fundamentally, you turn on the tap in this country, you ought to think you should be able to drink the water, right? And that didn't happen in Flint. So I spent the first couple weeks actually handing out water, hanging on the back end of a truck, delivering water. They said, don't tell people you're with DEQ. I told people I was with DEQ. They were appreciative. They were really a population suffering, wanting some help. And the thing that the mayor and the governor demanded was to think about the citizens. It wasn't about compliance. It wasn't about the water as much as it really was about, how about you if you're a parent or grandparent? How would you feel? Think about the kids. Think about the citizens. So who runs the water treatment plant out there? Okay, how about the municipalities? Raise your hand, right? We're all pretty smart. We all know. So is 15 parts per billion health safety standard? Come on, is it? We're all talking about compliance, or we're all talking about 15 parts per billion. It's not a health-based standard, never was. It's a system integrity standard. So what's magical about 15 parts per billion? Good question. Think about that as you do your daily jobs, right? So the Flint issues, we've already talked about that. They had peak populations, the water use is down by 2/3, older homes, high vacancy rates. And if you take Dr. Monahan and Atisha's data and overlay it, what's the commonality? What's the commonality? You've looked at the paper. It's got to be lead service lines, right? No. It's the age of the water and the infrastructure. Now, that's not to say lead service lines aren't a problem. But that's to say, let's talk about the system in its entirety. So, I still can't figure out where to point this stuff. So, we all have the timeline, and I'm not going to talk a lot about the timeline. We all know about the heroes, and we all know about the engagement model wasn't right. We all know about being tone deaf, and guess what? If someone puts brown water on your desk, pay attention. Pay attention, right? No, we said this is in a mature system. What do you do if you have microbial contamination? How about, what do you do? Water treatment guys, what do you do? What do you have microbial contamination? What do you do? Boil water, right? Maybe add a little extra chlorine. You add a little bit chlorines, what do you get? Trihalomethanes. What do you get if you get trihalomethanes? You do a little flushing, right? We know this. We know it well. Well, Bob put up that note that basically said that I'm not sure if the lead and copper rule contemplated a source water switch to a large municipality in this type of a situation. So as regulators, we're worried about regulatory standards, not worried about outcomes. How can that be? How can that be? And then worse yet is, when I came in, we didn't like EPA much. Right? We were talking about corrosion treatment and corrosion programs. We're not talking about citizens. So one of the first things I did is I have a weekly call with my good friend Bob Kaplan. Every week. What do you know? What do I know? What are we missing? Every week we deal with the city and have a conversation. What do you know? What do I know? What are we missing? We meet routinely with Jolisa and her group out at the water treatment plant. Right? Because too long it was segmented silo. And I'll submit that maybe in your communities, you're segmented and siloed. So we did the response, and as part of that response, we started taking samples. So we said, any residents, send in your sample. So we did residential sampling. As the governor said, we went into the schools. So where does the lead source come from? Schools? And the lead service lines go into the schools? Any school have a lead service line? No. There's no lead service lines going to the schools. There's no lead coming out of the plant. So where does the lead come from in the schools? The fixtures. And so then we started talking to the schools and we started testing fixtures, and then, so what do schools do after vacations? Do they flush systems? Do they reduce the age of the water? Do they think about the impact? Absolutely not. So where are we as communities? Where are we as water experts? Where are we as worrying about kids? What are you doing for that? Well, that's pretty expensive, Director. That's time-consuming, Director. That's the right thing to do, Director. So we need to think about engaging those at-risk populations, as the governor said. Then we started doing extended sentinel sampling. What's a sentinel sample? Well, we overlaid all the information we had in the city about age and infrastructure and service line material and at-risk populations and incomes. And we said we need to make this representative across the city. So we came up with a sentinel program, thanks to George Christian. Talked to George about it. And so we continue to do that. And so how many, we talk about asset management. So who knows what service lines are in their communities within a 95% confidence level? And what shape it's in? Very few. So how do you do integrated asset management planning if you don't know what you have, where it's at, and what condition it's in? That's tough. So we'll beat up General McDaniels and say, get those lead service lines out, right? So you put lead in back in the 20s and 30s because it was the preferable material, because it bent, didn't break. Flint was very affluent, so between the service and the curb box, that was lead. Those that were workers, sometimes that was galvanized from the curb box to the house. So how do you figure that out? How do you do that? You do it through some high-end testing with my friends at EPA doing sequential testing to see where the lead's actually coming from. That's how you do that. There's ways to get the information if you really want to do it. So that's the latest extended sentinel testing. So 90th percentile is 8 parts per billion. So we've declared victory, go home, right? No. You heard the governor say the idea is get the lead out. That's the goal, that's the outcome, and that's why General McDaniels will tell you how to do that. So the next steps, it's really reduce age of water, remove lead sources, build capacity, focus on early childhood nutrition, and replace aging infrastructure. That's what it's about. And I'm running out of time here pretty quick, Rich, so I'll be quick. So infrastructure is not Flint alone. It's across the state. It's across the country. So we set up the 21st Century Infrastructure Commission. So what grade did Michigan get from the American Society of Civil Engineers on infrastructure investment? We had a resounding D, right? So across the state, not just in Flint, this is a state problem and a national problem. We haven't paid attention to infrastructure. So how do you rebuild infrastructure when you don't know the demographics, what the needs are, what the age are, what the vacancies are, and what you want to be when you grow up? That's part of this conference. Because the idea is not to build what you had. Don't build what happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Build what you need in the future. And that's tough. And that's visionary. And that's hopefully what comes out of this conference. So I was at a little gathering the other night. Rich actually let me offer a night. I went to an Irish gathering. They had some people from Ireland, and the guy's playing whatever instrument he was playing. I could hardly understand what he's saying. He looked at me, and he said, well, coming from the airport, your road's got a different texture. I thought that was really, a good way to put it. We do have a different texture on our roads, right? How about the last mile? How about connectivity for kids? How are you going to create a job in those rural areas if you don't have broadband? How about energy where you can't stand up manufacturing? What are you going to do for energy? And then what are you going to do for sewer and water? And I did chair the subcommittee of sewer, water, green infrastructure. It's $800 to $1 billion under investment on an annual basis. But part of that, Jan Beecher will tell you, is about rates, about being transparent. People will invest. People will invest in quality of life. They will invest if they can see a direct return on their investment. So with that, there's over 100 recommendations, but the first critical step is really an integrated asset management plan. Know what you have, manage it, and here comes the hook. Thanks.